You ever go on a little trip just to get away from it all? Break free of the hustle and bustle and go somewhere where you can relax. Maybe out in nature, a camping trip for the weekend. And you ever come back from a nice time alone in the great outdoors just to find out, wait a second, where the heck did everyone go? Oh, they all died in a massive global plague and now I might be one of the last, if not the last, person alive on planet Earth? And you ever then spend the next days and weeks wandering the empty, desolate streets until eventually you meet up with some scraggly survivors, over time form a collective, and obsess over trying to teach the next generation how to rebuild civilization, only to find, they're just not that interested? And then over the course of decades, you watch as your small, intimate tribe adopts a more animist worldview and begins to live as hunter-gatherers again? Classic, am I right? This is the story of Earth Abides, a science fiction novel by George R. Stewart. It's not your typical post-apocalyptic tale. It challenges some of our core notions about progress, human happiness, and civilization itself. It's a study of how our infrastructure would crumble in our absence, and the ecological adaptation that follows. How lands once smothered in concrete would be reclaimed by weeds, and brief successive surges of ants, rats, and even mountain lions. It's about how human groups organize without the enforcement of the state, and how culture changes over time, taking us from the immediate aftermath of the sudden collapse of civilization to a future when the last generation, known only as the Americans, leaves behind a people who barely know what the United States once was. Written all the way back in 1949, Earth Abides was a story ahead of its time. In fact, it's probably still ahead of its time. In this two-part series, astrophysicist, writer, and friend of the show Tom Murphy rejoins the podcast to unpack and discuss the fascinating thought experiment of Earth Abides. Welcome to Human Nature Odyssey, a podcast imagining unexpected futures that shift our sense of self, society, and our relationship with the natural world. I'm Alex Leff. Well, yeah, you and I talked like a month ago or so, and you mentioned having read this book, Earth Abides, and you were recommending that I check it out.
Mm-hmm.
And I read it first when I was in 8th grade. I think this was the last book that my dad was reading to me for bedtime. In my memory, he stopped reading it halfway, and then I ended up finishing the second half on my own.
I see.
And it kind of corresponds with an interesting point in the book where I was like, whoa, reading this on my own now felt like the old world had gone away.
Right, because they relied a lot on the trappings of civilization for a time, and then, throughout the course of the book, they depended less and less on that, as you were depending less and less on your father reading the bedtime book.
Yes, exactly. So very thematically appropriate. I'm curious how you heard about it and how it was pitched to you.
So I remember who recommended it to me, and I remember where we were standing when he did. It's one of those things. There was an astronomer, Frank Hsu, who was quite well known. We had a lot of conversations because he was somewhat interested in energy issues, as I was, and sort of fate of modernity and that kind of thing. He was a broad thinker. So at one point, just in the hallway, he looked at me very earnestly, "You should read Earth Abides." I trust his recommendations, and if he says I should read this book, and he had this sort of very intense expression about it, I thought, okay, I will read this book, and I'm glad that I did. I've read it a few times over the years, and each time I see it through new eyes.
Yeah, I'm curious what you feel is the best way to go about this, because we're ultimately going to spoil the crap out of this whole thing for anyone that hasn't read this book before. I bet it's hard to not.
I think so.
I think we should just view this as we're essentially telling the story.
Yeah.
And for people who've read the book before, hopefully our thoughts are an interesting companion. And for people who haven't read the book, now you don't have to because we're about to
Exactly.
ruin the whole thing.
And I do think it would be really hard not to, because the change that happens is profound, and I'm not sure how we could talk about it without.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what do we know about this book? It's written by George R. Stewart. It came out, what, like 1948, 1949?
49. Yeah, it's old.
Yeah.
Older than me.
Yeah?
Yeah, yeah, it's 21 years older than I am.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy. And the book also has some pretty hokey elements to it. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's not
This is not a work of great literature.
it's not great literature. That I agree with that. Some parts make me cringe, right? And some of that's just 1949 mentalities. And some of it's he's not really a talented author at interrelationships, at personalities. He's a little weak on that point, but I think he's very strong in the rest of it. And so I think there's great value.
So maybe just to give people like a sense of what the scope of this book is, it's this sci-fi novel about this deadly virus that wipes out the vast majority of people on Earth. And we see it all from the perspective of this one young man named Isherwood Williams, nicknamed Ish. And we're experiencing, the immediate aftermath, but the book takes us all the way through to generations beyond the immediate aftermath when Ish is an old man and his perspective on all this changes drastically.
And what is it about us in books with the main character named Ish or Ishmael?
I know. I was thinking that too.
Moby Dick has to be next, right? That's going to be our next hit.
Exactly. Do you think Daniel Quinn read this book? I was wondering that a few
I
times.
wondered that too. And there were definitely times when I thought, oh, he must have. But of course, it's just a gut sense.
So, yes, I was also thinking about you with this character of Ish because he's a man of science.
Mhm.
I'm guessing early 20s.
He's a graduate student in geography, and he's out doing field work when this happens with his hammer. The hammer becomes important.
Yes.
He's basically a student of ecology and civilization, kind of multidisciplinary.
Okay, so how does it happen? It starts with him in a cabin. He is sick from this rattlesnake bite,
Right.
and people are knocking on the cabin door, and he doesn't know why. And then when they see him, they run away in terror.
Right. They see that he's sick and they just run for their lives.
Right. And as he heals and he's going back to town where he lives in the Bay Area.
Sort of the Eastern Bay over Berkeley. Basically, the campus is meant to be Berkeley.
And so as he's returning home, he's seeing that there's not many people about, and he slowly comes to realization with like, oh, something must have happened. Picks up like newspapers, right? And he's like learning about this deadly virus, and he avoided it by going on this camping trip, which is a good promotion for camping.
And possibly the snake bite helped him live when hardly anybody else in the world had. As he's going back out into the world and seeing abandoned places and piecing things together and getting, newspapers, he's piecing this together, and it's a real shock. But he has this kind of detached perspective. I'm a scientist. I'm an observer. This is fascinating. I'm just going to take it in and see what all this is about and try to find people. And so when he gets back to the Oakland, Berkeley area, he's looking for people, and he finds a few, but they're really damaged goods. They've gone.
Yeah.
He was protected from all the 1 week rapid die off or something on that timescale of all of humanity and everybody and everybody you love. And so he was somewhat isolated from that trauma, but the people who lived through it tended to be in pretty bad shape.
Still in shock.
Yeah, not worth teaming up with. You would think that you would want to band together, but the people he ran across were really in bad shape. And so he just decided to be, solitary and observe what happens when civilization gets a big shock like this.
The narrator is not Ish, but the narrator is very sympathetic to Ish's perspective. We're hearing his judgments.
Correct.
The narrator's not critical of him. And as the book evolves and as Ish's perspective changes, the narration's perspective changes, which I found really interesting. His personal temperament is somewhat antisocial. He doesn't need to be around people, and all of the social anxieties he had that had been weaknesses now are maybe a strength. and he finds himself maybe like uniquely capable in this kind of situation with some camping skills and staying alive and sane through being fascinated on seeing what would happen to the world.
Right.
There's so many great descriptions in the book. It reminds me of the book, if we talked about this, The World Without Us.
I don't know if we've talked about it, but I did read that many years ago. I haven't returned to it. But yeah, there are parallels for sure.
Alan Weissman is this nonfiction author who did a lot of research on how man-made structures, cities, any sort of infrastructure would erode and return to nature if we were to suddenly vanish. And, that book was written 50 years later. So
Hmm.
George R. Stewart in Earth Abides seems to have done a lot of research and thought on what would happen. And it's written very poetically. Like he talks about on page 36, there's these great little like italicized sections
Right.
that are like stepping outside of the narrative and more like commentary on the overall world.
Hmm.
And so this is just an example of like one of these little italicized sections soon after he's realizing that all humans are gone. In that day, as in some ancient time when a great king was overthrown and the remnants of the conquered peoples were jubilant against him, in that day will the fir trees rejoice and the cedars crying out, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Will the deer and the foxes and the quail exult? Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Is this the man that made the earth to tremble? It's like so mythic. And I love the
Hmm.
idea of imagining nature seeing this conqueror that had kept them all at bay for so long, now like falling to their knees and nature coming out being like, whoa.
Is it our turn now? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. What were some of the things you loved hearing about most about how nature was reclaiming and how things were eroding?
I do have a fondness for such things, and if I were ever a photojournalist or a photo essayist, I would probably pick that as a theme to see, weeds surrounding a tractor or mushrooms pushing up through asphalt or those kinds of things.
Totally.
Yeah, I think he has several examples of when the first storm comes and the drain gets blocked and water runs down the front yard of this house and seeps under the door. And so surely this carpet's going to get moldy and eventually collapse. And so all the defenses that we normally maintain slowly erode. And a big theme in the book is about the electricity, when the electricity is going to fail. It's hydroelectric and it's portrayed to be pretty automatic. I'm not personally so sure that it would last as long as it did for that case, but also water systems and gas delivery systems. So there are these infrastructures that he talks about eventually going by the wayside one by one,
Hmm.
streets that are now blocked by trees growing up in the cracks. The cracks started small and grasses, but those plants pushed the cracks wider and made an anchor point for dirt to collect. The grocery stores are a big deal because it's stocked with all kinds of food, and anything in cans and jars do pretty well, but any other packaged materials the rats get to and things spoil. Anything without refrigeration spoils. And so the dietary choices change dramatically, and pretty soon there are kind of no chickens because these domestic chickens are wiped out by coyotes and raccoons and whatever else, and aren't really made for this world. And we've got all these products of animal husbandry where we've made poodles instead of wolves, and a lot of them just aren't up to the task of living in some sort of ecological relationship because they've been fenced in and sheltered and fed and protected to the point where they're no longer really viable.
Yeah, he talks about like different animals boom and bust as nature's struggling to like create a new equilibrium after all humans disappear. The rats,
Hmm.
there's just this period of time where there's just rats everywhere.
Hmm.
And he watches almost this like horror few days he's living in of just like rats on top of rats on top of rats. And then there's this just die off, and he can see the way like rats cannibalize themselves because rats are only so prevalent because humans were around to create the perfect conditions for them. And can imagine that, oh yeah, really, like without a city, a rat's just a minor character in a forest and kind of
Right,
hiding in the shadows there.
right. and they surge on the temporary surplus left behind by civilization, but it's not a long-term solution. And yeah, there are various waves of different animals that kind of prosper, and you go up in sequence from ants to rats to mountain lions,
Right.
and they sort of, as you get to longer time scales and larger animals, you can get these boom and bust cycles. But that's just all part of the ripple effects of some calamitous discontinuity in the way the world is organized.
Okay, so then he goes to his parents' house who live on this street. What's the name of the street?
San Lupo Drive.
Yeah, San Lupo Drive, which becomes an ultimately very important, but not quite yet. He like goes to his childhood home, realizes his parents must have died. The book's not super emotional, but he talks about maybe he's still in shock from it. But he leaves and he goes on this great American road trip trying to cross the continent and gets all the way to New York City. And he realizes once he gets there that he wanted to just kind of like see it, to see like if something like New York City was silent, then that would be a confirmation of just how like, oh, this had to have been everywhere.
Right.
He meets this hilarious couple, these two stragglers who are traumatized, but are kind of going about their lives, maybe drinking themselves to death. They didn't know each other beforehand, but they're like referring to each other as husband and wife.
Mm-hmm.
They're middle aged. They're playing games of bridge at night with him or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. They temporarily take him in, and he recognizes the kinds of people that were just on autopilot going about their day, not thinking about big picture concerns. Because of that tendency, they're doing pretty well in this situation, all things considered. But ultimately, it's just like, I can't stay with these people.
Yeah, they're very pleasant people. He enjoyed his time with them. They were sort of in denial and sort of outraged that there's not a block of ice anywhere in New York City, for my martinis. And he didn't give them high odds of doing well through the winter. And he said there'd be plenty of ice then, but for your martinis, but otherwise they're not going to fare so well. They weren't in great physical shape, and they weren't cut out for making do on their own. Whereas he ran across some farmers in
Oh,
Arkansas,
right.
a trio. No family members tended to survive. It was extraordinarily rare that any two survivors would be related. And so people would band
Mm.
together, and there was a trio, a man, a woman, and a younger boy who seemed to be getting on with things, growing crops and keeping pigs, and had some of those skills. So he thought these folks are probably going to be okay. They're more connected to the land already.
Yeah, they were already a little more self-sufficient in how
Exactly.
they were living their
Right.
lives. And so he goes back to the Bay Area to, I keep forgetting it. Was it San what?
San Lupo Drive.
San Lupo
Right.
Drive, to his childhood home. Oh, he gets a dog along the way, names her Princess,
Right. Little beagle
as his
type.
companion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Useless dog, never caught a rabbit, just always going off barking and baying, and, very inconvenient, but a companion. And that was important to him.
And then so he meets this woman in San Francisco, or maybe down in
Down
Oakland.
in
He
Oakland,
somehow
yeah.
her name's M.
Yeah.
And the characters aren't too fleshed out, but we know that she's very strong and confident and
Mhm.
has like a certain sort of like intuition that he's very intellectual. Like he never quite really understands it. Maybe that's why we never get a good description of it. She had children that died during what is soon called, in Ish's mind, the Great Disaster.
Mhm.
But they embrace each other, they become partners, and he brings her back to San Lupo Drive. There's one thing that I thought was really interesting. It's like on page 111. The book is like really subtle about it. It doesn't go too deep into it, but she talks about, it sounds like she was mixed race, like maybe
Yeah.
her mother was black. She references it at one point. And again, this is still 1949 in this book. And she's like confessing that to him as if it would be like something he'd be worried about. And he tells her like, hey, listen, like the racists are dead.
Right.
We don't have to.
We get to make the rules. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then they have a child together.
There's one element about that. When she finds out that she's pregnant, Ish is kind of panicked for several reasons. He's very conflicted. Should we bring a kid into this, post-disaster world? And lots of things can go wrong in the childbirth. And so I'd better go look at all the books and study obstetrics, because he had access to basically the Berkeley campus library, and that was his cathedral of
Yeah.
all the knowledge that would be necessary to rebuild civilization. And that's where this theme starts to emerge in the book, this awe over the library. And so he goes to get some books on obstetrics, but gets distracted and finds books on other things and, says, we've got plenty of time. And in the end, basically, the child is born without any books necessary to have
Mm.
that happen. And so that's one of his early lessons in problems just kind of work themselves out. And M didn't really see the need to study up. She'd had kids before and said it's not so bad. Like it's gonna work out. So he's a worrier. Ish is a worrier,
Yes.
and that's a real theme through the book. And M is very not
Yeah.
a worrier and keeps telling him to just go to sleep. It'll be fine. And so she really kind of helped calm him in a lot of ways and indicate that the problems weren't as big as he was making them out to be in his head.
Yeah, totally, which I think, yeah, you're right. That's like a central theme of the book. And I had the quote from 121 of when he really begins worrying. It says, "Now that he knew himself soon to be a father, he had suddenly a new attitude, a feeling for the future. The child should not grow up to be a parasite, scavenging forever, and it would not need to. Everything was here, all the knowledge." Talking about, like you're saying, like at the university. Ish starting now, he has like what I would call like this civilization mania. Like he just really wants to rebuild back to civilization. And he is a warrior. He's a very anxious person. And I thought the book kind of is showing how like civilization itself is a response to an anxiety disorder
Yeah,
to some extent. And
right.
I personally relate to this a lot. I mean,
Mhm,
I've been working on this a lot. I've changed my mindset significantly,
mhm,
but I'm naturally a big worrier, a big planner.
mhm,
Planning is obviously what you do when you're worrying all the
mhm,
time. And there's these two different personalities of Ish and M,
mhm.
of her just like saying it's all gonna work out. And I can totally relate to Ish's perspective where it's like, it's all gonna work out. Like that's so irresponsible. And ultimately he has to figure out like what can I want to restore civilization, which is just what he takes for granted is like what we need. But in order to do that, it's just this constant uphill battle that he struggles with the whole book.
Yeah, that's right, and that really is the fascinating element of the book, and I will point out that I highlighted, see that little margin bracket, that's how I note significant parts, that's the
Oh
part that
yeah.
you just read, so we're highlighting the same parts, that's good.
I also highlighted so the next page, like he's taking on a lot of responsibility. Like he must see to it that the more important domestic plants did not vanish from the earth. It's like phew, it's a big responsibility.
Yeah, he's putting a lot on his shoulders. He himself
Yes.
is going to try to salvage or at least make easier the salvaging of civilization. And that's why he starts when kids start coming along. He and M have their own
Hmm.
kids, but some others find them who,
Oh yeah,
by
right.
this time, if you've kind of made do for several years, you're not the damaged goods people who self-destructed, what he called secondary kill after the great
Hmm.
disaster. And it's not hard to you've got a little smoke column coming up from your fire or whatever, and people find you. And so they found some quality people. They had 7 survivors, and those survivors started having children, and they really got along well. And so Ish started trying to educate them and teaching them to read.
Teaching the kids,
The
yeah.
kids, because that this was you can't this library is useless if the kids don't know how to read. And so this is step 1. And, early on, it was kind of interesting that the he was having trouble getting the kids to pay attention to school because they wanted to go fishing. And the kids had initiated this fad of fishing. And this happens a lot throughout the book where the kids get really revved up about something and they go gangbusters on it. And fishing was one of those earliest ones, which had a lot of practical application, right? Here's some tasty food that's not out of a can that we get ourselves. This was to Ish a bit of a distraction, but to the kids, it was not only fun, but served a really great function. Yeah.
I have this other quote of Ish's civilization mania. It seems like he's the only person of the 7 survivors that's really has this obsession with returning to things how they are. I mean, George and Maureen
Mm-hmm.
are another couple of the survivors. George, he's just a hardworking, hands-on handyman.
Yep.
He keeps his painted white picket fence. Something that I thought was kind of funny is that so they all move on to San Lupo Drive, and they live in separate houses.
Right.
And Ish talks about how like they all go home for like dinner in the evening, and I was like, I think given the situation, they would be much more communal than that. But maybe that's like this idea of like the nuclear family kind of like sticks with them at
Mm-hmm.
first.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes to George and Marine's house, and they have all these items that no longer work, like a television set, a radio, a phonograph.
Right.
And Ish realizes, oh, they're holding on to these things. Like these were symbols of prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
And so now they're just like holding on to the symbols,
Mm-hmm.
even though they have no function anymore.
Right.
And so like that's how George and Marine are holding on to the past. So I wrote this quote. So Ish is like obsessing with himself. He's like, we got to get civilization back into some kind of running order. Civilization wasn't just only gadgets and how to make them and run them. It was all sorts of social organization too, all sorts of rules and laws. And he's like trying to figure out, how can we have a form of government? How can we have punishment? How can we have the state? And I was just like, oh, Ish, let it go, man. But there'll be these big social gatherings, which he is lamenting that they're not parliament procedures. They're just kind of more like these hangouts where people are like casually discussing things. He wants there to be some order. I have this one quote where he dreams about encountering the governor of California with the sign on his truck that says U.S. government. He's just like, oh, those were the days. And I think from a psychological viewpoint, I was thinking about how some people really crave authority because that's how kids feel safe. Some
Right.
kids feel safe.
That's how they grow up.
Totally. And then the people that really crave like authority from like a state are the ones that I think don't realize, oh no, we must grow up to become adults. Authority of the state is for adults who just don't have the emotional or mental capacity to like take responsibility of their own lives was something I was
Right.
thinking about.
Government as kind of the parental unit for adults. Is sort of what happens when you move out of your home where you had an authoritarian regime at home, parents who ruled the roost, and now you go out into the world and you want that similar safety, paternalistic protector.
Totally.
So yeah, I think a lot of people do see government that way.
Ish is struggling with the loss of the government more than he's struggling with the loss of his own parents.
Right. And at these social gatherings, he will get on his soapbox and he'll be very moved and just passionately talking about what they need to be doing and that they're slacking and the years go by and they don't make any progress. And then somebody will inevitably start clapping. And he always takes the bait thinking, oh, I really got across this time. But they're just making fun of him because he always does this. Oh, good old, same old speech, Dad, and it keeps happening. And he doesn't learn the lesson that he's the oddball. And
right.
He's not representative of how that human tribe, they come to call themselves the tribe, how they operate.
And just for context too, so this is 22 years past after the great disaster. So I wrote how Ish is really obsessed with like all these shoulds. This is one of his speeches that he apparently repeats. He says, like, we ought to be teaching the children to read and write. We ought to send an expedition to find out what's happening in other places. We should have more domestic animals. We ought to be growing food. There's part of me as someone who's critical of civilization that's frustrated with him, but also I found something interesting. Like he doesn't want them to just live as scavengers. And he's using that word scavenging as opposed to foraging. And I was thinking of maybe there's a really interesting distinction between scavenging and foraging. He's recognizing that like they're living their lives just living off of the remains of civilization, but they're not actually learning how to live off of themselves. And at first I was like, oh, okay, he's disturbed that they've kind of become like hunter-gatherers and he wants them to do what civilization did, which is like grow our own food, take control over our natural environment, have a say of when we eat, don't let it just up to nature and the gods. But then I was realizing, well, maybe also what he's disturbed by is that they're scavenging off of non-renewable resources.
Yeah.
And that's so different from foraging. He knows that they're taking these things that one day are not going to exist anymore. And like, so then what are they going to do? I found Ish's concern is somewhat similar to like our concern of how we're using energy.
Yeah.
We are scavenging in the ways that we're getting our fossil fuels and our energy and coal and fracking. We're scavenging from these things. I feel the ish worry of, guys, what do you think's going to happen in a couple generations from now? This isn't sustainable. So like, on one hand, he's advocating for a return to civilization, but on the other hand, he's like advocating for trying to have them be self-reliant and sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, I think by this point, 22 years in, he's recognized that things aren't moving really fast. Civilization's not roaring back. And so we've got to have at least an intermediate term game here where he hasn't really let go of the idea of civilization coming back yet, but he realizes it's going to take a long time. And in the meantime, those cans are getting pretty janky of food. They're doing more hunting, but they're using rifles and there are plenty of bullets around, but he's recognizing that A, the bullets run out and they probably stop working as well if they get moisture or whatever, they're not going to hold up. And so he does worry about the just complete reliance on all of these old materials and recognizes that they need to be smarter about things.
I thought something wanted to ask you about that I was reflecting on as well. Like he's arguing with M as he often does before bed about how like they need to do all these things, and he's saying, but in the old times, people thought about the future. Look at the way they built up civilization. And it's such an irony of civilization because on one hand, yes, it is civilization's like really obsessed about the future, trying to stockpile and create surplus so we can have more. It's not really trusting that like, well, we'll figure it out. We'll get what we need. But also at the same time, civilization is the form of social organization that also seems to be like the least practically concerned with the future
Mm.
in that it's not looking towards future generations being like, I think this is actually going to destroy everything if we keep going on this path. I'm curious what you think about that seemingly inherent contradiction to civilization.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think that's correct in that the horizon becomes very short. And part of that is due to the fact that the traditions of 50 years ago are no longer really valid. I mean, life changes so quickly and the context changes so quickly that I believe that makes people suspicious of any proclamations about the future. So that I often hear that, if I'm projecting something like an end to modernity or a return to something closer to hunter-gatherer lifestyles, the counter argument is, well, people 200 years ago couldn't possibly have predicted what we're doing today. We can't possibly predict what's going to happen in 200 years. And I think there's a lot to that. That's true, but
Hmm.
it cuts both ways. Many people today couldn't imagine that we would not have a lot of these modern conveniences, but that very well may be true. I think it's likely to be true. So there is a kind of throw your hands up. We can't know about the future. And there's a lot to that for sure. And there's kind of a so far, so good attitude. Look at what's happened in the last 50 years. We must be doing something right. Let's not really even question the premise because so far it's really going great.
Totally. Well, that's just so funny. It's like this inversion. You and me are the kind of people that are like, guys,
Uh-huh.
I don't think this is going so well. I think we need to like dramatically change things. Most people are kind of like, nah, I think it's gonna be okay. Like, someone's gonna invent something. We always figure it out. And we're advocating for abandoning modernity, whatever that means. But now in Earth Abides, after the Great Disaster, Ish is kind of in our position.
Mhm.
He's like, guys, I don't think this is going so well. We got to do something. But they're all like, we're going to figure it out. But ironically, he's advocating for a return to civilization.
Yeah.
And their mentality is what is allowing them to slowly transition into becoming hunter-gatherers again.
Yeah.
That personality of warriors and the Cassandras that are trying to rally the troops and the personality of, it's all going to be okay. It's just interesting how those personalities can like work in favor of either situation. And like we can see how that mentality of like, we'll figure it out, it'll be okay, is what allowed us to live as hunter gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years,
Right,
perhaps.
right.
But it's also what's so dangerous right now is we're like so complacent in a obviously catastrophic situation.
Well, yeah, and I think that, it's understandable that for most of human history and even before, tomorrow is going to be a lot like today and a lot like yesterday. Things don't change that fast. Modernity is a big, anomaly and an exception to that. But,
Right.
it's not strange that humans would evolve to basically have this conservative element of just accepting things as they are and not projecting any radical change. But you do want a few people. There are going to be a few people in a tribe who are weird and worry about things that others aren't, and you want some mix. But yeah, I was very much taken by, at one point, the water fails, and this took a long
Mm.
time, and this was a big turning point for them. They started to dig wells, but the kids and the other folks would work for a few hours on digging the wells, and then they go off to hunt and play. And there wasn't a big distinction between work and play.
Yes, I took a note of that. Yeah.
And it kind of felt like Ish was lamenting kind of their work ethic, that they were kind of lazy and only cared about their immediate needs, so that on that day that the water failed, well, some kids went to the spring and got buckets full of water. And so they were kind of okay for that day. So what's the big deal about all these wells? Like we can do that. And they're not wrong. That's the thing, is they were fine for that day. And I kind of feel like they took everything in stride. They were kind of happy go lucky. And I feel like the author was really kind of ahead of his time in recognizing that mentality among hunter gatherers,
Hmm.
what we would call a poor work ethic, but work and play were no different. And they just did what they wanted each day with some eye toward what do we need, but what do we need right now? And can we get that right now? And if the answer is yes, then we're good. So I think there's a confidence there in,
Yes.
our ability to make
And
do.
a faith.
Yeah, that's right.
Even though the author is kind of subtly making this point about how people are starting to blur the distinction between work and play, and he's not endorsing that because Ish is not endorsing that. Like Ish is very disturbed by that. Ish thinks they're lazy and this is a huge problem.
Hmm.
And the narrator is not subverting Ish's worrying. He's reinforcing it. If Ish is taking it seriously, the narrator's taking it seriously. You're seeing this like one man up against the like current of how society is going. I really love this middle section where he's trying his hardest to do something. He's asking on page 167, what made a society change? He saw a society reduced in size until it had attained the simplicity of a laboratory experiment. So he's just trying to figure out, what can I do to keep this continuity with the old world? But he realizes there's no reason to teach them property or economics. So here's a quote that I love on page 218. But nobody built any fences now, and he found himself having to start by explaining why people once had built them, a much more complicated matter to explain than you would think until you tried it. He thought of emulating the progressive school again by setting up a shop where the pupils could buy and sell and keep accounts. But this was not practical, for there was no more storekeepers now. He would have to start with a whole explosion. Did I mistype that? There's no way he said explosion.
Oh, exposition.
Exposition, that
Yes.
makes way more
Right.
sense, of ancient economics. He realizes another thing that he says on 168 is he could probably wield more influence in shaping of its future than an emperor or a chancellor or
Hmm.
a president in the old times.
Hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting how in a small community, individuals have more influence over their community than a dictator
Hmm.
has over a nation state.
Hmm. And he toys sometimes with this notion of he could set himself up as kind of not only a demagogue, but a demigod. That there's this
Mhm.
sort of superstition that the kids have built up around him and his hammer. So he
Yes.
could exploit that. And he realizes several times, I could be that guy and make this all about me and get, my wishes satisfied. but he always pulls back from that and doesn't want to become that guy.
And I don't hear him being tempted. I hear him like being really afraid
Mm,
of that happening.
right,
There's a few pages where he's obsessed with how superstitious they've become.
right.
They've come to all these conclusions the kids have about certain things that it's just like, no, no. He's had this hammer with him ever since his first camping trip. And he realizes that the kids revere this with some awe. And he's like, okay, maybe I should just take this down to the bay and throw it into the water.
Mhm,
Then he's realizing, like, oh no, that'll have huge
mhm,
metaphysical significance for them too. And here's a quote from 223: no matter what he said, it might easily be twisted and made into some kind of religion.
mhm,
Because he has all the kids come over, they're very polite and want to be good to him. He has these daily classes with them.
mhm.
And he realizes that him and the seven survivors are referred to as the Americans.
Right.
An American is almost taken on like a mythological
Yeah,
sense to the
because
kids.
they built this incredible city, things that these kids had no idea how to do. So it did look magical. Anything that didn't connect to their local geography was difficult. And at one point, he realized that
Oh, yeah.
he understood how to get around that area by street names, but might not know where the streams are. But the kids knew that extremely well because they had explored but they had trouble communicating to each other about directions because he was all about the abstraction layered on top of
Mhm.
this reality, and they were much more embedded in the reality of the geography that was more permanent, more relevant than a bunch of street names.
And I think that's a really interesting thing that the book brings up. I think about this too. We always talk about people being educated, who's educated and who's uneducated. But I kind of feel like it's impossible to not be educated. You can be uneducated about certain things, but if you live, you're going to be educated. People that have never gone to college are very educated just about different things, maybe things that we don't value, but Ish is carrying this assumption like he has to educate these kids because education is a thing that we do
Mhm.
to people. And if we don't do it, they're just going to be these primitive, uneducated, savages. Yeah, the book does a good job at showing how subtly, like, no, the kids are learning what they want to learn, and that's important to them. And that's so we got to talk about Joey,
Okay.
one of his youngest sons, because that's a key part of the book. And Joey kind of stands out from the other kids. Joey seems to be more of like have the natural inclination of being a bookworm and being interested in some of the lessons. Like when all the other kids' eyes glaze over, Joey is still really listening to his father.
Mhm.
And Ish, even though he views himself as very like non-emotional and like intellectual, we can see like he's starting to put so much psychological pressure on Joey as he even starts to jokingly at first, but then somewhat seriously refer to Joey in his head as like the chosen one.
Yeah. Right. All his hopes really kind of start to coalesce around Joey, that he realizes he's getting old and none of these kids are really interested in this stuff and none of them want to learn how to read. But Joey kind of picks it up just like that and starts reading books. Joey's not afraid of the hammer, also, this symbol that's so other
Mm.
kids don't want to touch it because it's powerful, but Joey sees through that. And so there are all these indications that they see each other. They get each other. They exchange looks, during community meetings, and Ish realizes that, okay, this is the guy. This is where all the hopes are. No pressure, but all civilization relies on this kid Joey.
And it also just made me feel so sad realizing like how profoundly lonely Ish is. This is someone who was probably going to become a professor at a university and
Hmm.
wanted to be around other people who were interested in that kind of stuff. And there's no other human beings left in the world, as far as he knows, that share his interests with him. And of course, he views his interests as the most important possible things. He's
Right.
very righteous about it. But even if we put aside like whether it's the most important or not, I just found myself like empathizing with Ish, and he's like sees Joey. It's like finally another person that wants to learn about this stuff, and just like, oh, what a powerful feeling that must have been.
Yeah, but Joey was also a lonely kid. He didn't fit in with the other kids. It's not that he was ostracized. They were really awed by his capability. The kids really respected and saw that, but he was still somewhat apart. And so they were lonely together in a way. They had each other.
I also just think, like, again, just from a writing perspective, like, I really love how we're seeing everything from Ish's view. We're seeing life and community evolve, how one person aging is experiencing it.
Mhm.
So we really feel Ish is a young man and very vibrant and like a leader in the community. And we can then kind of see his authority like slipping away from him as he's getting older and older. These things that we're learning about the kids and their superstition and how they feel about Joey, we're always just seeing it from Ish's perspective. And it felt like a very accurate description of like how a dad might, wonder like, what's going on with my kids? How are they treating him? You're always kind of peering in. There's no scenes that Ish is not there for in
That's
this
right.
book, which I thought kept us in a really interesting perspective throughout it.
Right. This is kinda like the GoPros attached to Ish's head, and that's the story that you're getting is Ish's experience the whole way through, for sure.
I would watch that movie. That would be
Mhm.
an incredible way to to tell this story. Just have a GoPro to a main character's head the whole time.
Do you know that they made a TV show out of this? Earth Abides?
No.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I was shocked to
I
see
would
that.
watch the crap out of this.
Well, I might, but I don't have that streaming service. I can't remember what it is, and I can
MGM Plus.
Okay.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Mm.
Tom, they made this last year?
Yeah,
What?
and I'll bet it sucks. I'll bet you and I would hate it.
Oh, I'm just sure it's terrible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe I should watch it because I'm such a I think the book has such great themes, but would a TV production actually be bold enough and ostracize its viewership enough to tell the story that we got out of it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that.
All right, and that is part 1 of our 2-part series on Earth Abides. And just so you know, since the initial recording of this episode, Tom and I both went back and watched the Earth Abides TV show. And if you even found this podcast because of that show, that's awesome. Welcome. I'm glad you found us. And obviously, everyone will come to their own conclusions about the show. But I will say, like Tom and I predicted, they changed how the story ends in a pretty crucial way. And next time, in part 2, we'll explore where this book goes next and the really radical message it ultimately shares. Maybe then it'll make more sense why a TV show would struggle with a story that challenges our dominant culture's narrative about civilization itself. Until next time, I hope you'll consider how you would structure a small-scale society if civilization went away. What from the old world would you try to continue? And what would you try and create entirely new? Well, it's not exactly a small-scale society, but there is a burgeoning online hub known as the Human Nature Odyssey Patreon. There you'll find others thinking about these kinds of things, as well as bonus episodes and writings. Thanks so much to everyone who's a part of the Patreon right now. Your support will help keep the podcast going for years to come. And also much appreciated are the people sharing Human Nature Odyssey with a friend and leaving a friendly review. And thank you to Tom Murphy for joining us today. You can find more from Tom from his excellent blog, Do the Math. And if you'd like to hear Tom's first appearance on the podcast, I recommend checking out our episode together, Astrophysics for a New Stone Age. This series was made in association with the Post-Carbon Institute. You can learn more at resilience.org. And as always, our theme music is Celestial Soda Pop by Ray Lynch. You can find a link in our show notes. Talk with you soon.